Behind the scenes, the airline's higher-ups scrambled. They had no idea this confrontation was happening. They'd never imagined that a routine flight could unravel so quickly. The last thing they wanted was to deal with a public relations nightmare, especially one involving accusations of discrimination. A decision had to be made fast. Either they sided with the pilot, or they took a stand for what was right. The pilot, meanwhile, began to second-guess himself. He had been so certain of his actions, confident in his belief that his decision would go unquestioned. But as he saw the ripple effect of his choice, a mix of anger, confusion, and disbelief among the passengers, his earlier confidence started to falter. He'd underestimated the power of one woman's presence and the strength of the support around her. The woman's dignity, despite the initial shock, only seemed to grow in stature, and her husband's quiet but firm insistence was becoming harder to ignore. The passengers, many of them now openly speaking out, began to make it clear that they stood with the woman. But just as the pilot thought he might have a chance to regain control, another unexpected twist hit. Word came in that a private jet was already on its way to the airport. The woman's husband, in those brief moments, had arranged an alternative flight, a way out that no one had seen coming. It was clear they weren't going to let this injustice define their journey. But there was still uncertainty in the air. What would the pilot do when the woman boarded her private jet? How would the airline handle the fallout? And what would happen to the passengers who had watched everything unfold? Tension simmered, and the story was far from over. The more the situation escalated, the more people began to realize this wasn't just about one flight. It was a larger commentary on how discrimination, whether blatant or subtle, could shape people's lives in ways that most never fully understand. As each new piece of the puzzle fell into place, it became clear that the ramifications would be far-reaching. As the private jet began its descent toward the airport, the sense of anticipation in the terminal was thick. Passengers still stared in disbelief, unsure of what would happen next. It seemed like the woman and her husband had won, at least for the moment. But then, just as the private jet touched down on the tarmac, a sudden announcement crackled over the loudspeaker. But before they could react, something even more shocking occurred. The doors to the terminal swung open, and a figure stepped inside, dressed in a sharp suit. It was the CEO of the airline, his presence commanding the room. He was flanked by several executives, all moving with purpose. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding," the CEO said, his voice cutting through the room. "And I also understand that this could have been handled very differently." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. The CEO was no stranger to the power of public opinion, and he clearly knew the risk they faced if this situation spiraled further. He turned to the woman, his gaze softer now, as if seeing her for the first time without the prejudice that had clouded his staff's judgment. "We're going to fix this," he said firmly. "Your flight will be rescheduled immediately, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure this never happens again." The woman didn't respond right away. She could sense the change in the atmosphere, but her trust hadn't been easily restored. After all, it wasn't just one pilot or one airline representative. It was an entire system that had tried to silence her. Her husband, never one to back down, stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Actions speak louder than words," he said, his tone low but resolute. "Let's see if you mean that." It wasn't just about getting on a flight anymore. It was about standing up to a system that had failed her. The CEO, clearly aware of this, nodded slowly, a recognition of the deeper battle at play. "We'll be in touch," he added, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. But just as it seemed like the conflict was over, a final twist left everyone in shock. As the CEO and his team began to walk away, the woman's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen and felt a chill run through her. There on her screen was a notification, a public post from one of the passengers on the plane. It had been a simple video capturing the entire confrontation, from the moment the pilot refused her to the arrival of the private jet and the legal papers. The caption read, "Watch how the airline tried to silence a woman's dignity. We won't let them get away with it." Asterisk. The post was already going viral. The woman looked at her husband. He gave her a slight smile, understanding what this meant. They'd won this battle, but the fight wasn't over. The airline, despite trying to patch things up, now had to face the consequences on a much larger scale. And as for the woman, her journey wasn't just about one flight. It was a movement. Her courage had sparked something bigger than any of them had anticipated. The CEO, seeing the viral post and the growing backlash, turned to the woman one last time. His face was pale, his earlier confidence evaporating. But it was too late. The truth was out, and the world was watching. Inside the coffee shop, the mood had shifted dramatically. What started as a tense and uncomfortable confrontation had transformed into a shared moment of triumph. The barista, though shaken by Karen's outburst, couldn't help but smile as the regulars filed up to the counter, offering their small tokens of solidarity. It wasn't just a tip, it was a sign of unity, a recognition of what they had all witnessed. Everyone, it seemed, had had enough of Karen's entitled attitude, and they weren't about to let her ruin their morning. As the barista thanked them, the group of regulars gave a collective cheer. "You handled that like a pro," one of them said, clapping the barista on the back. Others nodded in agreement, clearly pleased with how the situation had been handled. It was a small but significant victory against the entitled behavior they had all been forced to endure from time to time. The sense of community was palpable. Outside, Karen was still on her phone, pacing in frustration. Her attempts to salvage her ruined morning were growing more desperate by the second. She had thought she could control the situation, but now, as she watched the tow truck roll toward her car, reality was beginning to sink in. This wasn't the way she had imagined things going. In the parking lot, Karen's anger only grew as she snatched the note off her windshield. Reading it aloud, her voice thick with disbelief. "Thanks for parking like you own the place. Your tow is on the house." The words seemed almost too perfect, and the crowd that had gathered across the street began to laugh. Some even cheered. It was a moment of pure karma, a fitting response to her entitled behavior. Trying to assert some authority, Karen marched up to the tow truck driver and security guard, demanding they release her car. But her protests were met with nothing but professional indifference. The tow truck driver didn't even glance up as he continued his work, and the security guard, unfazed, calmly explained the situation. Her car was in violation, and the tow was entirely legal. Karen's face flushed as the reality of her powerlessness set in. Then, as if things couldn't get worse for her, a police officer arrived, summoned by a complaint about Karen obstructing the lot. Karen, now visibly distressed, tried to explain her version of the events, but the officer wasn't having it. With a polite but firm voice, he handed her a citation for obstructing traffic. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. For once, her entitled demeanor didn't work. The officer remained calm and professional, offering no sympathy as she fumed. The tow truck finished its work, and Karen's car was hauled away. She stood there, watching her car disappear into the distance, her anger bubbling to the surface. But there was no turning back now. Her day had been completely derailed, and it was clear that nothing was going to go her way. The crowd that had gathered, meanwhile, erupted into laughter, capturing the moment on their phones, knowing full well that this scene would be shared across social media in no time. For everyone else, it was the kind of moment they would remember for a long time. A perfect example of karma in action. Karen had believed she was above the rules, that her tantrums and demands could bend reality to her will. But in the end, it was her own arrogance that had brought her downfall. As she disappeared down the street, still ranting into her phone, the crowd began to disperse, satisfied. Phones were filled with videos and photos, and the story would soon be a viral sensation. The universe, it seemed, had a way of putting things back in balance. We regret to inform you that there has been a security breach on the private jet scheduled for departure. We advise all passengers to stay inside the terminal for your safety. The entire room froze. Eyes widened. Whispers spread like wildfire. Security breach. How could that be? Was this part of some larger conspiracy, or was it just a tactic to delay her departure even further? For a brief moment, the passengers looked to the pilot, wondering if he had any insight into what was happening. But instead of providing answers, he seemed just as lost as they were. The woman, however, wasn't so easily shaken. Her determination had already carried her this far, and now, facing yet another unexpected hurdle, she steeled herself. She couldn't afford to back down, not now, when so much was at stake. Her husband, quick on his feet, began making calls again, this time to legal counsel. He knew there was more to this than just an inconvenience. The timing of this security breach felt too coincidental. The airline, clearly trying to regain control of the situation, had likely orchestrated this delay in a last-ditch effort to force her back into submission. But the woman wasn't about to let the game be rigged. Just as she began to step toward the exit, ready to make a stand and take matters into her own hands, another surprise came. An airline representative arrived at the gate with a team of security officers, heading straight toward her. The cold professionalism of their approach only added to the tension. Were they there to resolve the situation? Or was this the beginning of something much darker? "I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to remain where you are," the representative said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We need to conduct a routine security check on all passengers before any further boarding can occur." The word routine felt like an insult. The woman's grip on her suitcase tightened. This was no longer about a simple travel mishap. It was about something far deeper. Was this an abuse of power, or just an attempt to erase her sense of agency and control? Every second that ticked by, the stakes grew higher. The pilot, watching from the sidelines, finally spoke up, his voice tinged with a mixture of regret and defiance. "I didn't ask for this. None of this was supposed to happen," he muttered under his breath. But his words didn't offer the woman any solace. In fact, they only fueled her resolve. He had underestimated her, and now it seemed everyone would have to reckon with the consequences of his actions. As the security officers closed in, the atmosphere in the terminal reached a boiling point. The tension in the air was palpable. Would they force her to comply, or was something far more explosive about to unfold? And if this was indeed part of a larger scheme, what were they really trying to hide? The questions hung in the air, unanswered and growing heavier with every passing moment. The tension was unbearable as the security officers closed in on the woman, but just as they reached her, her husband stepped forward with an unexpected move. Calm but unwavering, he presented a legal document to the airline representative. "This is a lawsuit against the airline for discrimination and wrongful delay," he said, his voice steady. "You violated my wife's rights, and now it's time for you to face the consequences." For a moment, everything stopped. The security officers hesitated, unsure of how to respond, and the airline representative's expression flickered between shock and uncertainty. This wasn't a passenger complaint. It was a full-blown legal action. The representative quickly glanced at the document, then back at the woman. He knew they couldn't ignore it. Behind the scenes, the airline's higher-ups scrambled. They had no idea this confrontation was happening. They'd never imagined that a routine flight could unravel so quickly. The last thing they wanted was to deal with a public relations nightmare, especially one involving accusations of discrimination. A decision had to be made fast. Either they sided with the pilot, or they took a stand for what was right. The pilot, meanwhile, began to second-guess himself. He had been so certain of his actions, confident in his belief that his decision would go unquestioned. But as he saw the ripple effect of his choice, a mix of anger, confusion, and disbelief among the passengers, his earlier confidence started to falter. He'd underestimated the power of one woman's presence and the strength of the support around her. The woman's dignity, despite the initial shock, only seemed to grow in stature, and her husband's quiet but firm insistence was becoming harder to ignore. The passengers, many of them now openly speaking out, began to make it clear that they stood with the woman. But just as the pilot thought he might have a chance to regain control, another unexpected twist hit. Word came in that a private jet was already on its way to the airport. The woman's husband, in those brief moments, had arranged an alternative flight, a way out that no one had seen coming. It was clear they weren't going to let this injustice define their journey. But there was still uncertainty in the air. What would the pilot do when the woman boarded her private jet? How would the airline handle the fallout? And what would happen to the passengers who had watched everything unfold? Tension simmered, and the story was far from over. The more the situation escalated, the more people began to realize this wasn't just about one flight. It was a larger commentary on how discrimination, whether blatant or subtle, could shape people's lives in ways that most never fully understand. As each new piece of the puzzle fell into place, it became clear that the ramifications would be far-reaching. As the private jet began its descent toward the airport, the sense of anticipation in the terminal was thick. Passengers still stared in disbelief, unsure of what would happen next. It seemed like the woman and her husband had won, at least for the moment. But then, just as the private jet touched down on the tarmac, a sudden announcement crackled over the loudspeaker. Imagine being told you can't board your flight, not because of anything you did, but simply because of who you are. That's exactly what happened to a Black woman at a major airport, where she was wrongfully denied access to her plane. For a moment, it seemed like just another case of mistreatment. But just 10 minutes later, things took an unexpected turn. As the airport staff stood in disbelief, her private jet appeared out of nowhere, landing just outside the terminal. The situation quickly escalated, and the airline's regret was palpable. What was supposed to be an ordinary day turned into a spectacle, as the woman took control of the situation in a way no one could have predicted. In the next moments, the airport staff would face the consequences of their actions. But how far would they go to make it right? Stay tuned to find out what happened next. Decision: the drama didn't stop there. What seemed like an ordinary travel day quickly spiraled into something no one could have anticipated. The airport staff, already on edge from the unfolding conflict, watched as the woman's husband orchestrated a masterful comeback. It wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a moment that would make the world take notice. The pilot, once so sure of his position, suddenly found himself facing consequences that were far beyond anything he imagined. The ripple effect of his actions spread quickly, and before long, everyone involved would realize just how powerful a single moment of bravery and conviction could be. The real question, though, is how this would all end, and whether the pilot's regret would be enough to make him rethink everything. Keep watching to see how this extraordinary story reaches its stunning conclusion. The tension in the cabin was palpable as passengers exchanged uneasy glances, still processing what had just happened. The woman stood at the gate, her eyes locked on the pilot, trying to make sense of what felt like an unbelievable nightmare. Her husband, standing by her side, remained calm, but everyone could see the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. He knew this wasn't just about one man's prejudice. It was about something far larger. As the minutes ticked by, whispers grew louder. Passengers who had once been passive now murmured in disbelief. Many had witnessed the pilot's behavior, and now they were uncertain whether they'd even be able to take off. What if the flight was canceled? What if this entire situation spun out of control? Meanwhile, the pilot's discomfort grew. He hadn't expected this level of pushback. He thought his authority was unquestionable, that no one would dare challenge him. But the woman's husband wasn't going to let this slide. Quietly, he called the airline's corporate office. The phone call was brief, but its effect was immediate. He had already gathered all the right details and knew exactly how to leverage them.